Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. I'm Jason Kitcat from Crunch, and we supported this work that you're going to hear a bit about tonight. Crunch, for those who don't know, specialise in services for micro businesses and the self-employed. We've got over 10,000 customers providing accounting, mortgages, insurance, and much more. And why are we taking part in supporting this work? Well, we found in supporting those customers that quite often there were policies coming from government that weren't perhaps as friendly to the small business and self-employed as they could have been. Perhaps they even had rather a large blind spot in relation to them. So rather than just being moaners, we thought we'd do something about it. So we formed a community that we call Chorus, which has over 24,000 members, to try and create a voice for the self-employed. But we also wanted to come up with positive suggestions. So last summer, we partnered with the RSA, whose work we hugely admire, with 20 suggestions in there for policy and how it could be more supportive for the self-employed and small businesses. We think it's an excellent report. We're not going to just put it on a shelf. We're going to go out there and spread the word. We're going to share this with ministers and decision makers and take this further. We think this is a continuation of a debate, not just a one-off piece of work, and hope you'll support the proposals as well.
We're all here because we know there's been a big increase in self-employment. It's grown by something like 46% since 2000 versus about 12% increase for employees. And since 2008, about half of all jobs growth in the UK is owed to self-employment. So it's a big trend. But the question is it a positive development? And if you look at the earnings statistics, you would say it's not a positive development. We know that if you look at government data, the self-employed full-timers earn something like a third less than their counterparts in wage work. And that difference has been growing, albeit marginally, over the last decade or so. So that, combined with some negative media reporting, gives the impression of a community that's in a very precarious and perilous state. And it suggests that this is not something we should be championing. But if you dig behind the headlines, and if you start to look at lots of other different data sets, you realize that this is a very complicated story. For example, there's a government survey that asks people directly, are you satisfied with your income? And what it shows is that the self-employed overall are only marginally less likely to be satisfied with their income than employees. So how does that square with this earnings difference? The community as a whole is also older, on average, than employees. And those who are approaching retirement or after retirement may have made a conscious decision to trade in high wages for freedom, autonomy, flexibility. And when I say autonomy and flexibility, I don't mean it in just the abstract sense. I mean it in a very concrete sense, in the way that some people can only use self-employment to get the freedom they need to look after their own mental health needs, their physical health needs, to care for loved ones, whether it's parents or children. So there are very real, tangible benefits that come from self-employment. Having said all of that, we shouldn't be blind to all the different issues that face the self-employed. So we know that incomes are very volatile, of course. Income goes up and down in line with the market. And there are various different protections that the self-employed forego. So no access to statutory maternity pay, sick pay, holiday leave. There's no such thing as a national living wage for the self-employed. They don't have employer pension contributions, and the list goes on. And for us, the real concern and danger is that the least affluent are locked out of self-employment. So the RSA had done some previous research looking at the link between wealth and entrepreneurship. And what we found was that those who had received an inheritance of £10,000 or more were twice as likely to move into business as those who had received no inheritance at all. So for us, the question isn't how do you save people from self-employment, it's how do you enable more people to take part in the meaningful kind of self-employment that we know exists, can exist, and which gives people that sense of purpose, that sense of flexibility that we all want from our jobs. Which brings us to this report. What we really wanted to do with this report was to find out whether policy could answer some of those challenges, and whether it could not just help people to survive in self-employment, but actually to thrive in doing so. So if you look at the last government's efforts, under Cameron and Osborne as Chancellor, they had a very kind of pro-entrepreneurial bent to their policies. They were strong advocates of entrepreneurship. They did things like reduce the high rate of corporation tax from 28% to 20%, and it's soon set to fall to 17% by the end of the decade. They did things like introduce a 1 in 2 out rule on regulation and red tape. They had a red tape challenge. They also improved access to finance through schemes like startup loans. And many of these initiatives were really promising. They had a big and positive impact, but some of them are quite hard to justify. And honestly, they seem quite shallow in some places. So for example, if you take corporation tax, the main rate falling from 28% to 20%, who's that benefiting? It's benefiting big companies that make quite large profits. It's not benefiting startups, particularly in the early stages of their business, not making a huge amount of profits. Same with the 1 in 2 out rule on red tape. It seems more of a marketing ploy and a PR mechanism than it is something that's really going to help most businesses in the UK. Also, government efforts have overlooked the individual that sits behind that business. So for example, there haven't been that many initiatives that look at improving access to private pensions, improving access to maternity pay, improving things like access to income protection insurance, all of these things that affect the individual as that person behind the business, not just the business itself. So if there's a core message that comes out of this report, it's that we want to see the government shift from this laissez-faire agenda, which is about cutting corporation tax, deregulating and hoping for the best, towards something that's much more hands-on and interventionist. And to step in and set problems right in a whole variety of areas. So not just looking at tax and not just looking at regulation, but looking at things like pensions, insurance, mortgages, employment services, business support, late payments, a whole different raft of issues. We recommend an attempt to equalise national insurance between the self-employed and employees, to some extent at least. We recommend changing business rates. It's an antiquated tax, ill-suited to an era of e-commerce. We recommend introducing a paternity allowance for self-employed fathers. There's nothing at all if you're self-employed and you're a father. We recommend also changing some aspects of regulation relating to home-based working. And also the big issue, which doesn't get enough attention, is universal credit. And we recommend some changes to that because at the moment it's going to be very detrimental to the self-employed, particularly on low incomes.
Well, I very much welcome this report, and I think it's very important in terms of putting self-employment on the map as one of the kind of big conversations for Britain, when I think there are an awful lot of people in Britain who are feeling that, shall we say, the odds are stacked against them, and recognising the way that the jobs market has changed. I think one small criticism of the report is I don't think you say much about unions. And actually, trade unions are probably the key organisation currently representing self-employed workers, whether that's in construction, the entertainment industries, or indeed, as you may have heard, drivers like those at Uber, where GMB took a very successful case to challenge whether or not they were genuinely self-employed. So, and I say that because actually unions have an important role in regulating in favour of positive self-employment, where it's a positive choice, and where it can be a really good work experience for people, and the sharp end, where we know things are going badly wrong. And I say that because whilst I recognise what you say about self-employed people being more likely to express satisfaction in the way that they're working, the hard truth is that there are 1.7 million self-employed workers who are on less than the government's national minimum wage. And that suggests to me that this significant rise that we've seen in self-employment is part of that bigger picture that is all too familiar of growing insecurity at work in different forms, whether that's 0 hours, temporary agency, what we still call casualisation. And frankly, it would be naive, I think, not to acknowledge that there are strategies around casualisation, as we've seen in whole industries like the building trade, or indeed broadcasting, for example, and not to recognise that that's a real issue. So for our part, we're concerned about pay, the level of it, the coming cuts in universal credit, which will hit a lot of those low-paid self-employed workers really hard, and what is a growing gap now between average pay for self-employed workers and average pay for the rest. You know, we are seeing a growth of low-paid self-employment. We're concerned about rights. We think that all workers, whatever status you have, should be entitled to certain basic rights, and that's why it was good to see, proposals around the paternity allowance to kind of drag rules into the 21st century and recognise how life is for people today, give them the support that they need. But clearly, I think we have to be really alive to the fact that in some cases we are seeing people reclassified as self-employed simply and clearly to strip them of the rights they would otherwise have as a worker, to the national minimum wage, to sick pay, to holidays, to the right to be accompanied by a trade union. And for us, these are rights that everybody should enjoy, and recognise that not every self-employed person is the next Steve Jobs. In many, many cases, people are on low pay, poor rights, and very little social protection.
So you look at a trend that's so pronounced as this and ask yourself why it's happening, and I could think of 4 reasons. One is that there's exploitation, that there are workers being reclassified into self-employed to make it cheaper for employers. One is that there are tax incentives to become self-employed or run a micro business. One is that there are red tape barriers to becoming a proper business, that rather than expanding and employing people, it's easier to work as a self-employed person to do projects with others. And the other is technology, which is what I've spent a lot of my time working on. And the way technology comes into it is that when the price of information and communication technologies falls as much as it has in the past decade and 20 years, it changes the efficient structure of organizations. And rather than the command and control, the hierarchies that you get when it's expensive to exchange information, you get dispersed activity, whether that's flatter corporations or networks of companies working together or more people working as individuals for companies. We've also seen the boundary between home and work blurring because of the technology. And that's happening in the way that we all know about, that you can do your work anywhere, so you do, and there are good and bad things about that, flexibility versus invasion. There's also the creation of a lot of media, a lot of value at home. Somebody might be writing open source software, or putting entertaining videos for free on YouTube, or writing fabulous, interesting economics blogs. And all of that is causing people to switch away from things that they buy in the market to these free open source goods. They're also doing other kinds of work. We've become our own travel agents, doing that kind of work at home. And equally, now when you go to the supermarket, the technology makes you do the cashier's work for them at those checkout machines that always break down when I go to them. So that boundary is blurring as well because of the technology. Now, I think we lack the statistics to understand what's really happening. We've got some idea, and Ben sets it out in the report, about the numbers of people and the average that they're earning in the different categories, but not enough really to understand how people are working with the new technologies and with the way the structure of the economy has changed in other ways. But I think of those 4 things I listed, they're all part of the story. There's going to be a bit of all of them. But a lot of people, with a policy framework designed for the past structure, which is delivered through firms, through conventional employment, taxes, pensions, allowances, maternity leave, even the structure of the education system is designed around a kind of structure that's increasingly breaking down, and the assumption that nothing productive happens at home, when lots of productive things happen at home, the things we've always never counted, like caring, and the things that are actually economically valuable in the market, like writing your open source software. So I think there are some really sensible and interesting proposals in the report, as well as some very provocative ones. But I wonder if one could think about it in a more fundamental way as well. And rather than treating these micro firms and self-employed people more like we treat existing big firms and conventional employers, could you think of it the other way around and design a framework of policies, a system of social security in its broadest sense that delivers to individuals rather than through organisations? That would decrease the barriers to growing from being a micro business to being a bigger business, because actually, if you are a very small company, running maternity leave, running sick pay, running the pension scheme, they are all actually quite significant hurdles to get over. That's quite a big step. So you'd get some more natural distribution of firm sizes anyway. I think it would also be in the spirit of the universal basic income conversation, which I'm not persuaded by because I think there are some very difficult trade-offs in there. But if you think of that a social contract in a broad sense as a contract between what the state delivers to individuals, then I think that would be another interesting way of framing that.
I mean, my reservation about that notion, and I think probably the reason that a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs like it, is that doesn't it just let employers off the hook? I mean, basically you're saying to employees, you don't have to be responsible for any of these things anymore. You don't have to pay people a wage that they can live on because someone else is doing that for you.
I'm not talking about the pay. I'm talking about the structures of the social contract which are delivered through employers currently, and raising the question about whether policies are best delivered through firms. Of course firms should pay properly and offer favourable conditions. And that structure of that's a structure that needs regulation. I think a minimum wage is necessary. I think unions are necessary, actually, because it's more important to think about organisation among individuals if you're framing it in this very individualist way. But my query is whether firms are the right vehicles for delivering the social contract.
When there's such a diversity of experience, how do you design any policy that is appropriate for everyone? Because I mean, I find this in my own reporting that I meet some self-employed gig economy workers who genuinely do value it, and really the thing that they often say is that it gives them a sense of kind of control over their own lives in a way that being a cog in a corporate machine doesn't. And I think that we can't discount that, and I think that the left in particular would be foolish to kind of dismiss that and say that's not a real thing. But at the same time, there clearly are other people who feel desperately exploited and have no control.
There's 4.8 million self-employed people in the UK. A lot of those are enjoying their situation. Likewise, with zero-hour contracts, it suits some people, it doesn't suit others. Same with agency work, same with temporary work. So actually what we did in terms of how this relates to this discussion in self-employment, what we did a couple of years ago was we did our own survey with the populace, and we decided to create a segmentation of the self-employed, which asked people a variety of questions about their experiences. So it didn't assume, it asked them about their experiences. It got beyond the top-line analysis of financial earnings data. We split the self-employed into 6 different tribes based on that analysis. 27% fit within what we call the survivor camp. So those who are struggling to make ends meet, but that still leaves nearly 3/4 who aren't in that situation. And even those who are in that survivor category, there's a difference between people who are struggling to make ends meet and want to go back into employment, and people who are struggling to make ends meet but really want to make it work in self-employment. And I think it's just worth understanding the nuance in this community of 4.8 million people. The question for us at the RSA is not how do you save people from self-employment, it's how do you enable more people to take part in the good kind, the meaningful kind, that we know really does work for a lot of people. So if we can steer our attention to the second question, that would be good.
Having good spaces to work with.
Exactly, yeah.